Who should own homes? Trump, Wall Street, and the worldwide housing affordability crisis. Good evening, and welcome to GAF Global Affairs Forum. I'm James Walker. Tonight, we examine a policy move that reaches far beyond the United States, one that raises a fundamental question facing societies worldwide. Who should own homes in an age of global capital? President Donald Trump has signed an executive order aimed at limiting Wall Street's role in single-family housing. Is this a turning point, or a political signal in a much larger global housing crisis? Let's break it down. On January 20th, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order aimed squarely at restricting large Wall Street investors from buying single-family homes, a move the White House says is designed to preserve housing stock for ordinary American families and restore pathways to homeownership. According to Reuters, the executive order states clearly that large institutional investors should not buy single-family homes that could otherwise be purchased by families. This language is striking, not only because of its bluntness, but because it directly challenges a powerful segment of U.S. capital markets that has dominated post-2008 housing dynamics. This policy move comes amid mounting political pressure. Housing affordability has become one of the defining voter issues ahead of U.S. congressional elections this year, as mortgage rates remain elevated, supply constrained, and younger households increasingly locked out of ownership. Reuters, January 20, 2026. What the order actually does. Let's break down the mechanics. First, the order directs federal agencies to prioritize individual and non-institutional buyers, particularly when it comes to foreclosed properties. This is a significant reversal of post-financial crisis norms, when distressed homes were often sold in bulk to investment firms. Second, it instructs the administration to restrict federal programs from facilitating sales of single-family homes to institutional investors, effectively cutting off indirect government support for large-scale corporate home acquisition. Third, and critically, it mandates the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, U.S. Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, to review large acquisitions for anti-competitive behavior in the single-family rental market, with enforcement prioritized where market concentration harms consumers. White House Fact Sheet, January 2026, Reuters. The White House has also confirmed that legislative recommendations will be prepared to codify these restrictions, an acknowledgement that executive action alone may not survive judicial or political reversal. Why Wall Street became America's landlord. To understand why this order matters, we need to go back to 2008. After the global financial crisis, millions of American homes entered foreclosure. With households financially weakened and credit markets tight, institutional capital stepped in. Firms such as Blackstone, American Homes for Rent, and Progress Residential bought thousands of homes, often with speed, cash, and scale that individual buyers could not match. According to a 2020 for Government Accountability Office study, by June 2022, institutional investors owned approximately 450,000 single-family rental homes, representing about 3% of the national total, a figure that appears small nationally, but far more concentrated in cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, Tampa, and parts of Texas and California. Government Accountability Office, 2024, Reuters. The result: rising rents, reduced ownership opportunities, and increasing political backlash. A rare political convergence. What makes this move particularly notable is its ideological crossover. For years, Democratic lawmakers have criticized corporate home buying, arguing it inflates prices and undermines community stability. Bills to curb institutional ownership, however, have repeatedly stalled in Congress. Now, President Trump's executive order aligns, at least rhetorically, with those critiques, even as it emerges from a conservative administration traditionally allied with financial markets. This convergence reflects a broader global pattern. Housing affordability has become politically combustible, forcing leaders across the ideological spectrum to confront capital concentration in real assets. A worldwide comparison, the global housing reckoning. The U.S. is not alone. Canada has imposed foreign buyer bans and vacancy taxes, while debating limits on corporate ownership amid rising investor concentration. Germany has experimented with rent caps and municipal buybacks of housing stock from private equity landlords. New Zealand has restricted foreign investment in existing homes and adjusted tax rules to discourage speculative ownership. Singapore imposes punitive stamp duties on investors to preserve owner occupation. What distinguishes the US case is scale. American capital markets allowed housing to become a fully financialized asset class, tradable, securitized, and optimized for yield. Trump's order represents one of the most explicit acknowledgments by a US administration that financial efficiency and social affordability are now in conflict. The mortgage market angle. Earlier this month, President Trump also ordered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to purchase $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities, with the aim of lowering mortgage rates and easing financing conditions, Reuters, January 2026. Taken together, these measures suggest a two-pronged strategy: reduce demand pressure from institutional buyers, lower financing costs for households. Whether these tools will meaningfully shift prices, however, remains an open question. Forward-looking risks and unanswered questions. Several challenges loom. First, legal resistance. Institutional investors may challenge the order in court, arguing overreach, discrimination, or conflict with existing property and commerce laws. Second, supply constraints. Restricting buyers does not create new homes. Without zoning reform, infrastructure expansion, and faster permitting, affordability gains may be limited. Third, capital migration. Investors shut out of single-family housing may redirect funds into multifamily units, commercial rentals, or overseas property markets, exporting price pressures rather than eliminating them. And finally, political durability. Executive orders are reversible. Without congressional action, the long-term impact of this policy remains uncertain. As we watch this policy unfold, one thing is clear: the era of treating housing purely as a financial asset is facing growing resistance, not just in Washington, but worldwide. The question now is whether this marks the beginning of a structural rebalancing between markets and households, or merely a temporary political intervention shaped by electoral urgency, because beneath the politics and the headlines lies a deeper structural question that policymakers around the world are increasingly forced to confront. Who should own housing in the age of global capital? Housing as shelter versus housing as a financial instrument. For decades, especially since the 1980s, housing policy in advanced economies quietly shifted from treating homes as social infrastructure to treating them as investment vehicles. Single-family houses became assets to be traded, bundled, securitized, and optimized for yield, often disconnected from the lived realities of the families inside them. In the United States, this transformation accelerated after the 2008 financial crisis, when distressed housing stock met unprecedented pools of institutional liquidity. The logic was efficient. The social outcome was not. Trump's executive order implicitly challenges this financialization model, even if it does not name it outright. By drawing a distinction between families and large institutional investors, the administration is signaling that not all capital should compete equally in all markets, particularly markets tied to social stability. That is a powerful and controversial precedent. Will prices actually fall? This is where economics collides with political messaging. Restricting institutional buyers may reduce bidding pressure in certain local markets, especially Sunbelt cities where corporate ownership is highly concentrated. But national home prices are driven by broader forces: land use regulation, labor shortages in construction, demographic demand, and macrofinancial conditions. Even the $200 billion mortgage bond purchased through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is unlikely, on its own, to return mortgage rates to pre-pandemic levels. Structural inflation, fiscal deficits, and global bond market volatility continue to exert upward pressure on yields. In other words, the policy may slow the bleeding without curing the disease. And yet, politically, slowing the bleeding may be enough for now. Global capital will not sit still. One of the least discussed consequences of housing restrictions is capital substitution. If institutional investors are locked out of U.S. single-family housing, capital does not disappear. It reallocates into multifamily rental towers, potentially driving rents higher, into commercial to residential conversions, reshaping urban cores, into foreign housing markets, especially in emerging economies with weaker regulatory frameworks, or into financial instruments linked to housing, such as rental-backed securities. This is not speculation. It has happened before. After Canada tightened foreign buyer rules, capital flowed into private lending, pre-construction units, and purpose-built rentals. After China imposed real estate leverage limits, investment spilled into offshore property markets. Housing policy, in a globalized financial system, is never purely domestic. A signal to antitrust regulators worldwide. Another overlooked dimension of Trump's order is its antitrust framing. By instructing the Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission to prioritize enforcement against anti-competitive practices in the single-family rental market, the U.S. is implicitly recognizing housing concentration as a competition issue, not just a social one. This matters internationally. Across Europe, regulators are debating whether large landlords distort markets. In Africa and Latin America, urban land banking by elites and corporations increasingly mirrors the same dynamics, just with fewer safeguards. If housing concentration becomes an accepted antitrust concern in the U.S., it could embolden regulators globally to scrutinize land accumulation, speculative hoarding, and rent-setting power in ways previously considered politically untouchable. The electoral clock is ticking. Let's be candid. This policy is not happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding under intense electoral pressure at a time when younger voters, millennials and Gen Z, are confronting the prospect of permanent renting. Homeownership, once a cornerstone of middle-class identity, is slipping out of reach. And when that happens, trust in economic systems erodes. Trump's move may therefore be less about ideology and more about containment, containing voter anger, containing generational resentment, and containing the perception that markets only work for the powerful. Whether that containment holds is another matter. A precedent that will be tested. What happens next will matter far beyond the United States. If courts uphold the executive order, other governments may follow. If Congress codifies the restrictions, the policy becomes durable. If prices stabilize, the political narrative strengthens. If prices continue to rise, the backlash may intensify. And looming behind all of this is a larger, unresolved dilemma. Can democratic governments regulate global capital without destabilizing the very markets that underpin their economies? Housing is simply where that dilemma has become impossible to ignore. As investors, regulators, and households recalibrate in response to this order, the world will be watching, not just to see whether home prices fall, but to see whether the balance between finance and society is quietly being renegotiated, because what is unfolding here is not merely a housing policy adjustment, but a stress test of the modern political economy, one that pits democratic accountability against the gravitational pull of large-scale capital. The generational fault line. At the heart of this debate is a generational rupture. In the United States, homeownership rates among Americans under 35 remain well below historical averages. Similar patterns are visible in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and large parts of Western Europe. A generation raised on the promise that education and hard work would deliver stability now finds itself competing against hedge funds armed with cheaper capital, faster execution, and algorithmic bidding strategies. Trump's order speaks directly, perhaps instinctively, to this frustration. By explicitly framing institutional investors as competitors to families, the administration is recasting housing inequality not as personal failure, but as systemic imbalance. That framing matters. Once inequality is framed as structural rather than individual, policy intervention becomes politically legitimate, even necessary. The silent role of central banks. Yet there is a contradiction that cannot be ignored. For more than a decade, ultra-loose monetary policy, low interest rates, quantitative easing, and asset purchases helped inflate housing prices globally. Central banks stabilized economies, but in doing so, they also inflated asset values faster than wages. Institutional investors did not create this environment alone. They exploited it. Now, governments are attempting to correct downstream consequences without fully confronting upstream causes. Restricting buyers addresses who participates in the market, but not why housing became so attractive to global capital in the first place. As long as housing remains one of the safest inflation hedges in a volatile world, pressure will persist, policy or no policy. Could this backfire on renters? Another uncomfortable question lurks beneath the surface. If institutional investors are discouraged from buying single-family homes, will they tighten rental conditions on the homes they already own? Will rents rise faster as firms attempt to protect yields? Will maintenance be deferred? Will tenant turnover accelerate? Evidence from other markets suggests mixed outcomes. In some cities, corporate landlords professionalized management. In others, they extracted value aggressively. Trump's order does not directly address tenant protections, rent-setting behavior, or lease practices. That omission may become politically salient if renters, already burdened by inflation, see little relief. The international ripple effect. Outside the US, policymakers are watching closely. In Europe, where housing shortages intersect with migration pressures and climate-driven urbanization, limiting investor participation may soon be reframed as a national security and social cohesion issue. In Africa, rapid urbanization is colliding with speculative land accumulation. In cities like Lagos, Nairobi, Accra, and Johannesburg, middle-income families face dynamics eerily similar to those in the US, only with weaker regulatory oversight. If Washington normalizes the idea that housing markets can and should be partially insulated from financial concentration, it may provide political cover for emerging economies to act more assertively. Markets hate uncertainty, but they adapt. Financial markets are already adjusting expectations. Equity analysts are reassessing exposure to single-family rental platforms. Private equity firms are exploring alternative structures, joint ventures, minority stakes, land banking partnerships, to remain active without triggering regulatory scrutiny. This is how capital responds, not by retreating, but by reconfiguring. The effectiveness of Trump's order will therefore depend not just on its language, but on its enforcement rigor. Antitrust reviews that lack teeth will change little. Aggressive enforcement, however, could permanently alter the risk calculus. A question bigger than Trump. Strip away the personalities and election cycles, and the underlying issue remains unresolved. Should access to shelter be mediated primarily by markets or moderated by public interest? This question predates Donald Trump and will outlast him. It confronts governments in liberal democracies, authoritarian states, and developing economies alike. Housing has become the clearest mirror of inequality because it is unavoidable. You can delay marriage. You can postpone children. But you cannot opt out of shelter. And when that shelter feels increasingly controlled by distant financial actors, the political consequences are inevitable. As the administration moves toward legislative proposals, as courts weigh the legality of executive action, and as investors recalibrate strategies, the world is entering a phase where housing policy may become the front line of economic legitimacy, and that raises yet another critical issue that policymakers have barely begun to address. And that critical issue is responsibility. Who bears it, how it is exercised, and what happens when it is deferred for too long. From policy signal to global responsibility. Housing crises do not emerge overnight. They are cumulative, built through years of policy choices that favor liquidity over livability, yield over stability, and scale over community. The executive order signed by President Trump is, at its core, a signal, not a solution. It signals that governments can no longer pretend housing is just another asset class without social consequences. But signals must be followed by systems. Without coordinated reforms, zoning modernization, infrastructure investment, labor force expansion in construction, transparent land registries, and credible tenant protections, no restriction on investors will deliver lasting affordability. Markets will adapt faster than policy unless enforcement is disciplined and global coordination improves. Advice to global leaders. To leaders watching this moment from capitals around the world, Washington, Ottawa, London, Berlin, Abuja, Nairobi, Brasilia, the message is clear. 1. Treat housing as strategic infrastructure. Like energy and food, housing underpins social stability. Leaving it entirely to market forces invites political backlash and long-term economic fragility. 2. Regulate concentration, not participation. Capital has a role, but unchecked accumulation distorts markets. Competition policy must evolve to reflect modern housing realities. 3. Build supply aggressively and intelligently. Demand-side controls without supply reform are temporary fixes. Zoning, permitting, and public-private partnerships must move at the pace of demographic change. 4. Coordinate across borders. In a globalized financial system, unilateral action shifts problems elsewhere. International dialogue on housing investment standards is no longer optional. 5. Anchor reforms beyond election cycles. Housing policy must survive changes in leadership. Codification, independent oversight, and data transparency are essential. Advice to global citizens. And to citizens, renters, aspiring homeowners, families navigating rising costs, the moment calls for vigilance and engagement. Demand clarity, not slogans. Ask how policies will be enforced, measured, and sustained. Organize locally. Housing outcomes are often decided at municipal levels where zoning and permits live. Hold institutions accountable. Public agencies, regulators, and lenders respond to scrutiny. Think long-term. Sustainable affordability is built over years, not news cycles. Your voice matters most when housing is framed not as a privilege, but as a shared foundation of economic dignity. Key takeaways from this analysis. The U.S. executive order restricting institutional investors in single-family housing marks a global inflection point in housing policy. Housing affordability has become a worldwide political fault line, transcending ideology. Financialization of housing delivered efficiency, but also exclusion. Restricting investors alone will not solve affordability without supply-side reform and strong enforcement. Global capital adapts quickly. Policy must be equally adaptive and coordinated. The ultimate challenge is balancing market efficiency with social legitimacy. As the world recalibrates its relationship with housing, this moment will be remembered not for who signed an order, but for whether governments and citizens collectively chose to redefine housing as a human-centered system rather than a purely financial one. And that choice, quietly, persistently, will shape cities, economies, and democracies for generations to come. Housing is no longer just an economic issue. It is a test of social stability, political legitimacy, and global governance. As governments, markets, and families navigate this moment, one thing is clear: when shelter becomes speculation, democracy itself feels the pressure. Thank you for watching GAF Global Affairs Forum. If you value deep analysis beyond the headlines, like, share, and subscribe. I'm James Walker, and this is World Analysis.